Thrive is a research program on early childhood development. It is estimated that there are at least 250 million children living around the world today who will not reach their developmental potential. And this is because of inadequate care and stimulation in early childhood. Thrive aims to generate the much needed evidence on how to design policies and programs that can address this problem. I'm Sonia Krutikova, Research Director of Thrive, and this is the first in a series of conversations I will be having with researchers, practitioners, policymakers about the importance of early childhood and ways in which children who do not have the best start in life can be supported. Today, I'm joined by Catherine Porta, Professor of Development Economics at Lancaster University and the Director of the Young Lives Study of Child Development, which has been following 12,000 children in different parts of the world from birth to adulthood. I've asked Kath to set the scene for us by telling us a bit about what she and her team are learning about the importance of a good start in life. So Kath, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks.
Could we start with you telling us a bit about the Young Life Study and what makes it so unique?
Thanks so much, Sonia, and thanks for inviting me. Young Lives, as you've just said, we're following 12,000 children, and the countries are Peru, Ethiopia, India in 2 states, which is Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, as well as in Vietnam. And it's coordinated by the University of Oxford in the UK, and then we have teams in the 4 study countries. So what's unique? I think basically the length of the study and the breadth of the study. So it began at the turn of the millennium. So we were following babies born just after the year 2000, plus an older cohort of children who were aged 7 to 8 as a comparison. And we've been following them since that time. So now it's more than 20 years, and they're no longer children, of course. And we've managed to keep in touch with more than 80% of them so far, which is a huge achievement. And it's really nothing to do with me. It's our teams in the countries who really take great care to track and trace the children and as they've grown up. The second thing is the breadth. Like I've said, we have a very broad spectrum of people working in the team. I'm an economist by background, like yourself. We also have nutritionists, psychologists, education specialists, psychologists, and anthropologists working with us. And that allows us to have multiple perspectives on life and ask questions about various aspects of life, which is really how life is. And there are 3 main components to the study that's been going on over the 20 years. The backbone is our quantitative survey, which takes place every 3 to 4 years. We visit the household of the child or teenager or adult now, and we spend something like 3 hours interviewing. We ask about all aspects of life, from early life nutrition, vaccination, breastfeeding, through to school experiences, children's work, well-being, and we do maths tests, we do vocabulary tests, all sorts of things over time. We've also surveyed some of the schools that the children go to and have been to, their primary school and their secondary school. And finally, we have a smaller but much more in-depth component, the qualitative research component, where we take a selected subgroup of children and we follow them and speak to them for sometimes up to a week and really delve deep into their lives using qualitative research methods.
Wow, that is really impressive depth and breadth, like you say. Hard to imagine just how much information you have on these kids. And sounds like you have a really incredibly diverse group of children in the sample across these 4 countries, presumably spread out across within each country, so also representing the diversity of the groups within country. Can you give us a bit of a flavor of what childhood is like in some of these settings?
Yes, absolutely. So the study was designed to follow the lives of poorer children. So we don't capture the very richest children in each country, but we do have a good geographical spread, urban, rural, and different ethnic groups, for example. The contexts are quite different. Peru was the best off country in 2001, and Ethiopia was the worst off. For example, 1 in 8 children didn't even make it to the age of 5 at the time we started the study. So, yeah, life, there's a lot of similarities about childhood in different places and also differences. Let me start. There's a young boy I wanted to talk about called Afterwork. Now, just to say, we never use the real names of the children. And Afterwork is football obsessed when we first met him. When you asked him anything, it would always come back to football. What makes you happy? Football. When are you sad? If you're not playing football, which is really similar to a lot of kids around the world. The difference for Afterwork was that he'd already lost both his parents. They'd both died by the time we met him. He lived with his brother and he lived with his cousin. He did like going to school almost as much as football, but he had to drop out when his father died, and then he managed to get back into school later. He also couldn't focus just on school. He had to manage a few different household responsibilities. In particular, he was responsible for doing the dishes and making the beds, which is a little bit unusual for a boy, and sometimes he was not super happy about having to do this kind of job. Let's turn to India. I want to talk about a young girl, Harika, again, not her real name, in Andhra Pradesh. And she was growing up in a rural village. So there was no sanitation, there was no water as she was growing up. She was the only girl in the family, and she had an older and a younger brother. Now, she did go to school, but she had to keep missing school during the cotton picking season, which is about 3 months a year. So she was having worries at the time about how to manage the combination of working with the cotton and then getting back to school and trying to catch up. I've got one more, Fabrizio in Peru. He was 5 years old when we first met him. Indigenous Quechua family in a rural area. And he was the youngest of 6 siblings. And when the interview was happening, there were chickens wandering in and out of the house. His mother was very concerned about how to support him because she couldn't read or write herself. And she was also worried about him because his older brother had died in a car accident and she didn't want him to get in cars. So that's just a couple of examples, of which there are many we have. And I think, you can see there are some things that are very much in common, that the sense of fun, enjoying to play, that kind of thing. But material conditions, absolutely not as comfortable, for example, as in the UK, and having to deal with uncertainty and unexpected events, which can really change life quite quickly and dramatically. And I think finally that children, many of them have a lot more responsibility at an earlier age to help with the household and potentially earn money and support the household as well.
Great, thank you. And really nice point about bearing in mind some of the commonalities and how kids are kids everywhere. So that brings us neatly to sort of the main question, which is, what are you learning about the importance of early childhood?
Yes, that's an excellent question. As now we have adults in our study, they're now 22 years old, and we're currently in the field right now interviewing, and we can now look back at how their lives were in their early years and see how predictive the conditions that they grew up in the first couple of years of their lives were in terms of how adulthood has turned out. And we find very, very strong correlation between early life circumstances and later life circumstances. Now, Young Lives, it's an observational study, so we can't randomly manipulate sort of policies or that kind of thing. So we have to find creative ways to understand how changing conditions might affect child development. So one thing we've been doing is looking at climate data. So we've gone back and looked at climate shocks in early childhood, including when the child was in the womb. And we've looked at what the effects of such shocks, by which I mean a drought or a flood, can affect later life outcomes. And we find in India, for example, that there is an effect on life outcomes at age 15 when we measure that.
So that's incredibly striking, isn't it? Because there's so much that happened in those 15 years after the shock and before you measure, and yet you can still tease out that impact irrespective of what happened afterwards of that initial shock. That really brings home this point about what a foundational uh, point in the life cycle early childhood is.
Absolutely. And, there have been several studies about the effects of very large shocks, such as famines or big conflicts. Whereas what we're talking about here is the kind of shock that could happen every few years, sort of excess rainfall relative to the norm in the community, or a dry period, not necessarily a very dramatic, newsworthy event. And as we know, climate change means that these events are becoming more and more severe and affect the poorest more severely than anyone else. So I think being able to see that at 15, it shows that we really have to protect children from this kind of shock in the early years.
Yes, absolutely. And do you have some other evidence on, say, exactly what are the early childhood conditions that matter? Or I mean, this is beyond the scope, but really give us a hint about what it is about the childhood environment that's really important.
Yeah, I mean the idea of looking at the rainfall shocks or climate shocks, it's partly to be able to sort of tease out what might be affecting things, because everything is a bit correlated. The poorest families tend to be less educated. They tend to have worse sanitation, so no clean drinking water, no sanitation facilities. They tend to have parents who are perhaps less knowledgeable about childcare practices. They might live in communities with crowded housing, that kind of thing. So it's a lot of it is very correlated. The idea about looking at the climate shocks is to sort of tease out something that's external to your environment. Your parents didn't control that; they can't control the weather. So we see this as an income shock, basically. It affects households, especially agricultural households. It affects their ability to earn a living, and so therefore to buy good food for their family and feed their children, or the mother to get good nutrition in the early life. So we think nutrition is a very strong channel. We think that disease is a strong channel, which could be through sanitation, for example. And then we think that parenting actions can also have an effect.
And so, I mean, this really paints in some ways a very depressing picture because somehow these first couple of years just seem to be so formative. Um, can you give us a hint? This is a topic for another conversation, perhaps, but just is there no chance for remediation later on? So, taking your example, if things improve for the family when the child is 5 or 7 or 9, can that counteract these negative effects of the early childhood conditions?
Yeah, I mean it's a really important thing, because the agenda has been first 1,000 days. It's been really important to build that agenda and to advocate for early nutrition, early childhood interventions. But equally, if a child is 7 or 8, do we want to then say investments are not worth it? So we've just done some work very recently looking at children at the age of 12 in Peru and Ethiopia. And there we have found in both cases that social protection did remediate the effect of early life adversity in terms of, again, weather type related shocks, and that social protection programs, those children who benefited from the program actually did catch up compared to those who didn't benefit from the program.
Wow, incredible! And is that supported by wider research, or is this sort of quite new findings from the Young Life study?
In this particular case, we were looking at something called foundational cognitive skills. So we tend to measure what we call cognitive or or academic achievement tests. We do things like measure maths or vocabulary, that kind of thing. The foundational cognitive skills are things like executive function, self-regulation. These are the kind of building blocks of inside your brain that help you to do well on something like a maths test, to regulate your life, to remember instructions, to juggle tasks, that kind of thing. Things like working memory or inhibitory control. And we actually measured these using tablets in the fourth round of Young Lives. It's a few years ago now, 2013. And in fact, your good self, you were involved in that study, measuring using the tablet and getting children to basically play games where they had to remember where dots were or click on one color dot depending on the instruction and another dot depending on the other instruction. They were actually quite fun for the kids, so it was really helpful in terms of building rapport with them. Anyway, using those, we could build up a profile of these foundational cognitive skills. And so that is what the innovation is in Young Lives. There's already evidence that maths test scores, for example, can be remediated, but there's also plenty of evidence that it can't be. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to really build the evidence base on how important the early years are, and when and where could we remediate in future for children.
But a real glimmer of hope in terms of the potential for programs and policies to have that remedial role. So
Absolutely.
sadly, we have to wrap up. You've set out the agenda for us, so that's great. Clearly a lot to do. Thank you very much. Really important and fascinating research, and really striking examples of how fundamental the first few years of life are. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So, having set the scene and discussed just how critical the early years are, next time I will turn to what a huge difference well-designed programs to support young children and their families can make. And helpfully, Kath has already given us a hint about this. But until then, thank you for listening.